Castro. I'm Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Passing the Torch, How Will Internet Governance Change in a Post-American World? The goal of today's event is to discuss the future of Internet governance, particularly in light of the transition proposal that was submitted to NTIA to have the U.S. government hand off oversight of the ICANN function, which is, of course, one of the key technical management functions on the Internet. Before we begin, I just want to do a few logistics. This event is being recorded and webcast. If you're participating online, you're welcome to use the hashtag Passing the Torch. Also, as many of you know, there's a hearing later this morning. Our event is ending around 10:30. They have a hearing on the ICANN issue starting around 10:15. So right after our event, we're going to stream the hearing here in this room. Everyone is welcome to stay. We're going to have some refreshments here. If you'd like to do that, we also have an ICANN bingo game if you'd like to participate. Although I don't know if we decided on a prize, but you'll have bragging rights. So.
Just want to clarify that ICANN is not a sponsor.
That is a illicit use of the trademark name. But we can discuss trademark and stuff like that. But anyway, we're going to first begin, before we get into the panel discussion, we're going to begin by hearing opening remarks from Larry Strickland, the Assistant Secretary for Communication and Information at the Department of Commerce, where he leads NTIA, which is chiefly responsible for signing off on the transition. And perhaps more than anyone else in the U.S. government, he's been at the forefront of this issue, and we're delighted to have him here today to share with us his thoughts on the state of the transition, his initial thoughts on the process of the proposal that we've received, and what lies ahead in the coming months. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. I want to thank ITIF and, of course, Daniel for holding this event on the evolution of Internet governance. Now, actually, I intend to focus my remarks more on the challenges and issues I see before us for the year ahead, and not so much on the ICANN transition. That's what this esteemed panel will cover. But I think given the recent ICANN meeting in Morocco, and of course the hearing this morning, I'll spend a few minutes here at the front updating everyone on the transition from our perspective. So I'm sure all of you know, if you're here today, that last week the Internet multi-stakeholder community completed its work on the ICANN transition plan, including the measures to enhance ICANN's accountability. And ICANN last Thursday formally transmitted the transition package to us. So we're now on the clock. And we've begun the process of reviewing the proposal to determine whether it meets the criteria that we set out when we announced the transition 2 years ago. And just to remind all of you, when we did announce that transition, we established some specific conditions that the plan has to satisfy. First, the proposal must support and enhance the multi-stakeholder model of Internet governance, in that it should be developed by the multi-stakeholder community and have broad community support. And more specifically, we stated that we will not accept a proposal that replaces the NTIA role with a government-led or intergovernmental organization solution. Second, the proposal has to maintain the security, stability, and resiliency of the domain name system. Third, it must meet the needs and expectations of the global customers and partners of the ICANN services. And finally, it must maintain the openness of the Internet. As I said in Morocco last week, we expect to complete our review in 90 days. Prior to completing our review, we expect ICANN and the community to go ahead and adopt all of the necessary bylaw changes to implement the transition proposals. So that's kind of the critical path element here, is getting those bylaws out for public comment, getting them written and then get them out for public comment, and then having the ICANN board take that public comment and adopt all these within that 90-day period. In our review, we will be joined by many other federal agencies who have equities in the Internet. Folks may remember that the Government Accountability Office put out a report on the ICANN transitions many months ago and made some recommendations to us as to how we ought to conduct our review. And we've acknowledged that we will be guided by those recommendations in the methodologies that we use to evaluate the proposal. And then, of course, as evidenced by today's hearing, we know that Congress has a strong interest in this proposal, and we certainly expect Congress to closely monitor and review the proposal, as well as our evaluation of the plan. And now, I will say that since we have begun our review of the plan, I'm not going to say anything more substantively on the plan itself or our evaluation of the plan until our 90 days is up and we issue our report. So that may dampen the Q&A here at the after I finish my remarks. Jamie, you have a question? By the way, we should point out, of course, it's St. Patrick's Day, and I have to admire Chris and his shamrock, which I assume means you will probably prevail in the Q&A here this morning. You'll probably, all of your teams will win in your bracket today at the tournament. And I understand the prize, they're out looking around the bakeries to see if they can find some green bagels to give you if you win later this morning. Here at this point, with the plan having been completed, I would like again to thank the internet community for all its hard work. I know some of you here participated in the process, and as I've said before, I think it represents the largest and most complex multi-stakeholder process ever undertaken. And I greatly appreciate the time and commitment you here in the room and other stakeholders have given to this process. And as I have said on other occasions, the successful outcome here will serve as a powerful example to the world of the power and capability of the multi-stakeholder model to solve these difficult internet issues. And this is an important fact as it has implications for the internet governance challenges we will be facing in the future. Already, our announcement and the amazing amount of work the community has completed has helped to catalyze and build support for the multi-stakeholder model around the world. In April 2014, a month after we announced the transition, Brazil hosted the successful Net Mundial conference. This conference brought together a wide range of stakeholders, including technical experts, civil society groups, industry representatives, and government officials who agreed that internet governance should be built on democratic multi-stakeholder processes. This was then followed by the ICANN high-level meeting in June of 2014 in London, where government ministers demonstrated their support for the IANA transition and for the multi-stakeholder model in general. And then at the end of 2014, the International Telecommunication Union's plenipotentiary conference in Busan, Korea, concluded with a consensus outcome that the ITU should remain focused on its current mandate and not expand its role into internet and cybersecurity issues. We saw this momentum carry over into 2015. India, the world's largest democracy, announced its support for the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance at the June 2015 ICANN meeting in Buenos Aires. And last week in Morocco, the Indian minister once again reaffirmed his support for the process. Last December, the international community provided another boost to the multi-stakeholder model when the United Nations high-level meeting on the 10-year review of the implementation of the World Summit on Information Society agreed to extend the mandate of the Internet Governance Forum for additional 10 years. And this extension was twice the length of the original mandate of the IGF. The final outcomes document from last December includes language that affirms the primacy of the multi-stakeholder approach to developing the information society. So here in 2016, what do we see as the landscape for internet governance this year? We're seeing countries around the world continuing to grapple with the challenges of the open internet. Now, we all accept and take for granted that the internet has produced dramatic economic growth and incredible innovation and provides a platform for free expression around the globe. At the same time, we've seen the growth of sophisticated malware and other cybersecurity threats, and an increasing need to protect the privacy of internet users and to combat the theft of intellectual property online. These challenges have tested governments' ability to balance these important interests with the equally important need for openness. In their attempts to do something to protect their citizens and businesses, governments sometimes rush to put up digital walls between their countries and the rest of the world by proposing or instituting data localization laws, as well as imposing limitations on data storage, data transfer, and data processing. Such moves, however, threaten to undermine the central idea of the internet as a global connected network of networks. And in responding to these concerns, governments sometimes lose sight of the power of the multi-stakeholder process to find solutions to these problems. So, in addition to the IANA transition, here are the leading internet governance questions for 2016 as I see them. First, will the multi-stakeholder model expand to meet the needs of the developing world? With its new 10-year mandate, the IGF is poised to play a major role here if the global internet community takes up the challenge. This will also be an important year to determine if the Net Mundial initiative can become a useful resource. It has been handicapped from the start by its failure to make a compelling case to attract the support of the business community and the internet society. Its initial funding runs out this summer, so it really doesn't have much more time to demonstrate what value it can provide. The terms of the members of the inaugural Coordination Council, which includes my secretary, Secretary Pritzker, those terms end in June, and we are expecting the Council to launch a public consultation this spring as it determines whether there is a future direction for the initiative that the community will support. Second, where is China in the internet governance debate? While we have been pleased by the growing support for the multi-stakeholder model, we're under no illusion that nations that favor a government-run multilateral approach to internet governance are going away quietly. And China is interesting because it's among the countries that have sent mixed messages on its support for the multi-stakeholder approach. China participates in ICANN, and it even served on the first two accountability and review teams. Minister Liu Wei has said supportive things about the multi-stakeholder model in the past. But does December's Wuzhen conference indicate that China is now intending to go its own way on these issues, more in line with its recent statements about the cyber sovereignty of nations and the need for multilateral, not multi-stakeholder internet governance? Third, can the multi-stakeholder model be used effectively to address internet policy issues that come up in the context of privacy, cybersecurity, and other issues where governments historically have had a mandate to act? For our part at NTIA, we have been utilizing the multi-stakeholder process the last few years as an alternative to traditional legislation and regulation, and we will continue to do so this year with respect to work on drones, cybersecurity, privacy, and copyright issues. In this regard, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, promulgated a landmark document 5 years ago, the OECD Internet Policy Making Principles, which support the utilization of the multi-stakeholder approach to deal with policy issues. The OECD's ministerial meeting in Cancun in June will provide an important opportunity to reflect on and assess the effectiveness of these principles. And finally, for the Department of Commerce and NTIA, how can we help American businesses navigate their way through these issues as they attempt to establish markets for their products worldwide? As a start, the department announced last week the creation of a pilot program of digital attachés in our foreign commercial service to ensure that U.S. companies can participate in the global digital economy and reach markets around the globe. This new program will provide support and assistance to help U.S. businesses successfully deal with digital policy and regulatory issues in foreign markets and expand exports through global e-commerce channels. NTIA will be involved with this initiative along with other bureaus at Commerce in helping to train these attachés who are members of the Foreign Commercial Service operated by our International Trade Administration. So we're in the final year of the Obama administration, and in our remaining time, we will remain active and engaged around the globe, whether it is at ICANN, the IGF, or in any other venue where these issues will be debated and discussed. And we will continue to work to ensure that the internet remains a dynamic platform for innovation, economic growth, and free expression. Thank you for listening. So Daniel asked if I would take a few questions, and I will, subject to the caveat I made earlier.
But you won't answer any.
Try me. Mike.
Larry, I'm on the organizing
And
committee.
you have only a one-part question. You're famous for asking like four-part questions.
And one
If you
part
could just
question.
introduce yourself for the.
Mike Nelson, I work for Cloudflare, web security firm, and I'm also on the organizing committee for the Internet Governance Forum. The multi-stakeholder model is wonderful in theory, but when it comes to reality, somebody gets to pick who's in the room for key decision making. Someone gets to pick who's on the organizing committee for the IGF. At Wuzhen, the Chinese got to pick who came within 50 kilometers of the meeting.
But you're not claiming that was a multi-stakeholder
They did,
event.
and that Mundial was as well. But
I think they now are saying it's multi-party.
so how do we get to a true what's a pure multi-stakeholder process where everything's from the bottom up, where somebody isn't deciding who gets to be in the room, who gets to be on the podium, who gets to be in the key negotiating meeting?
But I think the true processes, it's not necessarily the way you describe it. For example, the way we run them at Commerce, they're open to all comers. And all we do is facilitate. We don't designate who can speak. We don't designate who gets in the room. It truly is open to everybody. And when people are there, it's the job of our facilitator to make sure that people have an opportunity to be heard and to speak. Everyone's treated equally. So there's no reason why you have to have a process to exclude people or to elevate certain people. But what I find is that for a lot of people, the multi-stakeholder process is great as long as they get their way. And that's not the way the model is designed or intended to operate. I think if you look at how the ICANN process worked, it was about as bottoms up as any process you could imagine in terms of people volunteering, people having an opportunity to participate. Yes, they had people designated as members, and they asked for the different advisory committees and supporting organizations to designate representatives to the accountability working group and the transition working group. But anybody else could participate, and when you were attending the meetings, you couldn't distinguish between who was a member and who was just in the audience. Everyone was heard equally. Everyone was given an opportunity to speak. So I do think these things can be more bottoms up. It's just that a lot of times people don't want to take the time to allow it to evolve, and they then tend to put top-down direction into things. Sometimes you just maybe need that spark to get it going a little bit. I mean, even the Net Mundial initiative, or the Net Mundial conference, there was a little bit of selectivity at the front end in terms of putting together the organizing committee. But in the end, the actual conference was carried out with absolute equality between participants, where the government representatives had to stand in their line and the civil society people stood in their line, the business people stood in their line, and they just rotated around to get the input. So, but it's something I think people ought to pay attention to and work on as they look to continue to use these processes.
So that invites the second question, which is, how do you deal with Nelson's rule, which is that in multi-stakeholder processes, the people with the least to say usually have the most time to say it?
With the least?
Yes, have the most time to say it. So you have people filling up the mailing lists and taking to the microphone for long diatribes.
Busy enough at Tribe Fair?
So I'm not going to agree with your characterization. I think there are certain extroverted types that like to talk. There are other people who want to think and are more, reserved in terms of speaking a lot. But if it's a good process, you find a way to engage all those people.
That's the challenge, the good.
And I think the lesson of the ICANN process is that every once in a while, I think there had to be an opportunity to bring a larger section of the community into the discussions. And fortunately, I think the ICANN meetings, particularly the Dublin meeting, I think was a very important one for helping to get that on track, or to get it running a little more smoothly, because I think you had a lot more people with a lot more at stake coming directly into the discussions and participating in a way that perhaps they hadn't for the 2 months or so beforehand, when it looked like the group was floundering a little bit. But if, at the end of the day, the way people stuck together and continued to test different approaches and to get comment and to back up and rethink things, it was a pretty amazing thing to watch at the end of the day. Yeah.
My name's Gary Hoffman. I'm just a retired engineer. I'm not anyone well versed in this, kind of just an observer. But just a question for if China is not part of this multi-stakeholder process in the way you envision, doesn't that ultimately lead to the fragmentation of what you're trying to achieve here? And then second, what do the other multi-stakeholders feel about that? I just don't understand quite how that works. you have this country that doesn't participate?
It shouldn't lead to fragmentation. Again, the processes are designed, if run right, to be open to anybody. So you shouldn't be in a situation, and I think ICANN showed this to great effect, that there shouldn't be people out taking shots at the thing saying, well, I wasn't allowed to participate, because the answer is get in there, participate. And I think what you have is, at the end of the day, a report that appears to have broad support of the community. So I'm not sure why there's anything about the process that should lead to any kind of fragmentation, or as long as it's run in an open and fair way.
Bruce Hyman with Kano Gates. Sort of in passing, you mentioned drone policy in connection with the internet. I haven't heard those two linked much before. What's the
Sorry. We have a multi-stakeholder process underway right now to look at the issues of privacy as it relates to the use of commercial use of drones. It's been underway now for several months. And so it's people coming together to, in a multi-stakeholder fashion, to talk about these issues, develop best practices, try to work through some of these issues in a field where, it's a brand new exploding field, and the issues and implications are still being experienced and uncovered by people. So it's a great place to have these kinds of discussions and have people working to find solutions or best practices, as opposed to jumping in and trying to regulate that or legislate in this area before you even really understand the issues. And that, look at our website. I don't know when their next meeting is scheduled, but again, it's open to anybody who wants to participate. Okay? I thought there was one more hand up before.
Thanks. You had mentioned cybersecurity challenge. I was Chris Martin with Access Partnership. You mentioned cybersecurity challenges right at the outset, and that is one of the areas where governments have traditionally maintained a role. Even the Indian minister last week in Marrakesh had talked about, we support the multi-stakeholder model, but for cybersecurity, the government has a particularly important role. What's your thoughts on how to productively engage governments in this conversation to advance a multi-stakeholder way of addressing cybersecurity challenges that doesn't sideline governments, but productively engages them and the broader community, as that seems to be one of the pieces that, especially governments who maintain a much more strident role for the government to have, use that as a basically a wedge issue.
A lot of it depends on how we define it and how we segment the issues. I mean, there are certain aspects of cybersecurity, such as national security, and I believe that's what the Indian minister was referring to, where that has always been the province of governments, and in large part will continue to be so. But that's just a small, a slice of all of the possible sets of issues that you might deal with. So in our case, the issue we're dealing with in the multi-stakeholder process we have underway is the question of people finding vulnerabilities in software, and how do you get the software industry to where they don't view people out probing and testing their software as evil people who need to be stopped, and as opposed find a way to actually welcome that sort of input because it improves their products. So, and there are certain companies that are very open to taking that kind of information, but there's a real lack of trust out there right now. But this is an area where we're already seeing good discussions occurring that don't have to involve the government necessarily. I mean, that could turn into a government issue. Somebody could try to criminalize that behavior. But what you're really trying to do is to come up with a shared understanding that, hey, maybe this is actually good for security overall, to have people in a trusted environment who are out finding these vulnerabilities, and then having a mechanism, a process by which they can bring it to the attention of companies and be thanked for it, as opposed to being rejected or shunned for it. It's part of just getting people talking about it. So I think we have to find those kinds of issues where those discussions help and make sense, and then really try to push parties to sit down and have those discussions. Okay? Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Great. Now we're going to move into the panel portion of this discussion. We have a great set of panelists here today. Starting on my left, I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone. We have Jamie Hedlund, who's Vice President of Strategic Programs at ICANN. To his left is Victoria Scheckler. Victoria Scheckler is the Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at the Recording Industry Association of America. Chris Wilson is Vice President of Government Affairs for 20th Century Fox. And Jonathan Zuck is President of ACT, the App Association. So thanks all of you for being here today. I think we'll just, start by, I'd like to get your reactions just to the remarks that Larry just made here today. Especially, with his, maybe what advice, you can hear everything that's said, but also maybe what advice would you be giving to NTIA as they're undergoing the review right now?
I think the only advice I would give them is I think they should approve the proposals.
And I would think that in improving the proposal, they should look to the conference report from the .com Act for guidance into what those 4 factors meant.
And just for anyone who's not familiar with that, lay that out a little bit more.
Sure. In the .com Act, and there was 4 factors, I believe. Let me find them. Do I have them here somewhere? That were supposed to be used to meet the thresholds of whether the proposal will satisfy the U.S. government or not. Larry mentioned them at the beginning. They include making sure that it maintains the safety, stability, and security of the internet, the resiliency of the DNS system per se, maintains an open internet, and meets the expectations of all the stakeholders. In the topic itself, it expands upon what does that mean, and some of the language that was in there includes, and forgive me, I put my glasses to read this to you. That's preventing the spread of malware, phishing, counterfeiting, illegal sale of drugs, child exploitation, theft, and fraud. Neither tilted free expression nor massive censorship. In fact, enforcing contract provisions prohibits use of domain names for unlawful activity. Will promote another provision of the bill, which is to maintain the openness of the internet. And it goes on to describe what Congress feels that these 4 factors mean and how they should be measured, or how they should be evaluated in measuring this proposal. So we would encourage NTIA to refer back to that.
Chris?
So certainly agree with Vicki there. I think, and I think Larry said this both today, and I think in other venues as well, that NTIA is going to take a very thorough assessment of this proposal. Obviously, there's a lot to consider. And indeed, there's some work that still needs to be done. I think before we can officially sign off, including, as Larry mentioned, the development and approval of the bylaws, because ultimately, what this proposal has been put forward is sort of as instructions to ICANN and the CCWG to sort of coordinate and create bylaws that map to the recommendations that were put in the proposal. So those really are obviously the true guiding documents, guiding instructions for the community will be the revised bylaws. So I think and I fully expect that NTIA will do their utmost due diligence on the proposal. Larry's also committed to making sure Congress has an opportunity to take a good hard look at it as well, and we welcome those set of eyes additionally. So I no more advice than Larry's already said, and I think it's important to know that they will be doing a healthy review of this document as they should.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone. I think the topic of this panel discussion, and thanks for having me here, Dan, is interesting. I guess it's passing the torch. How will the internet governance change in a post-American world? I think there's a conference equivalent to clickbait that this would qualify. This is a attendance bait or something like that. And for a couple of different reasons. One is this notion of passing the torch. I think what's important to remember is that the organization that's been setting policies for the DNS for the past 18 years is still going to be the organization setting policies for the DNS for the foreseeable future, and doing so in the same way. So from that standpoint, the transition could be a non-event, right? The other thing is this notion of the very use of the term internet governance. I think is something that gets thrown around a lot as well. And that topic is so broad and has to do with so many things that to treat this as a transition of internet governance away from U.S. over to some post-American world feels a little bit like an exaggeration as well. I mean, ICANN's job is to manage the naming, of domains, the namespace, the DNS, in the internet. And so I think it's important to sort of keep that context when discussing the transition and the proposals that are in front of NTIA. And there are two proposals. One, it has to do with what you might call the transition itself, the actual functional role that the U.S. government played in the IANA functions, right? And approving things being added to the root. And then there's a whole additional proposal that has to do with enhancing ICANN's accountability. And they've both been long and involved, and I've had the pleasure of spending the last year and a half of my life working on the accountability portion of the proposal, which was 14,000 emails, I think, and about 800 hours of calls. And it was a crazy process. And as a software developer, I can tell you that the multi-stakeholder process is not the fastest way to get between 2 points, by any means, right? It's an ugly process. I mean, I've often thought that you could put a dozen people in a room and come up with essentially the same proposal in 2 weeks. But what it wouldn't have is all this airing of issues and all this cooperation that's taken place to get to where we are. And the fact that I think that everyone is dissatisfied with this proposal is a testament to its success. There's no one that's happy with everything that in this proposal. I mean, I haven't met a single person, and I think that that's probably where its strength lies, and probably makes it the proposal that, with maybe minor adjustments, and certainly the devil's in the details, as Chris mentioned. But I think it's the proposal that NTIA can accept, and that this transition can move forward.
That's a great segue. I want to do 2 things. I want us to start with a conversation about the proposal itself, and I want us to get into some of these broader internet governance issues that you bring up. So, starting with the proposal, I mean, as you mentioned, there are some things that people like, there's some things people don't like. What I think would be useful is maybe we can, again, just go down the line, maybe skipping Jamie initially on this one, because I suspect you're not going to have much to say on this. But, what, basically, how satisfied are you with it? And what's not in it that you think should be in it? What's in it that you should be? And maybe both from your perspective as well as if you see other perspectives that you think are worth highlighting.
Sure. And as Jonathan said, the devil is in the details on this one. We participate in ICANN through what's called the intellectual property constituency, and they did put out a statement on the accountability proposal. Some of the concerns that were raised include this concept of contractual accountability within ICANN, and as I understand it, there is at least some recognition that ICANN has the authority to enter into its contracts, but not the flip side of the coin in terms of its responsibility to honor and enforce those contracts. When we think about a multi-stakeholder model, it is based, in our view, on contracts, and it is both the right to enter them and the right to enforce them so the community knows what to expect. We'll have to see what happens with the bylaws to see how that plays out. A second issue that we remain interested and concerned about is what's going to happen with the discussion on human rights. As I understand it, that has been kicked off to work stream 2, and we'll have to see how that plays out. From our perspective, the UN Declaration of Human Rights is the right framework to think about, because it deals with a whole panoply of human rights and is peer opinion. We want to make sure that if ICANN goes down that road, it considers all the human rights. And then the last thing that I understand has also been kicked off to what they call Workstream 2 is staff accountability within ICANN. I understand that there was lots of discussion during the accountability process about what happens with the board and board decisions. But most of the day-to-day functioning that we care about, the operational world, is at the staff level. So we'll be very interested in that as well.
So I think, so I said one thing. First of all, on obviously, I'm representing today 21st Century Fox, and I work for 21st Century Fox. We're very much engaged in the ICANN community. I should also note that my sort of secondary job is chair of the ICANN business constituency. I'm not representing the business constituency today. But I can say that the BC perspective, business constituency perspective, we felt that the proposal has more or less met the needs of the general business constituency within ICANN and their desires and so forth. I think from Fox's perspective, we're actually generally happy with the proposal. Vicky's mentioned some of the issues that the IPC has raised, and I think obviously as a company that cares deeply about intellectual property and contract compliance, we share those concerns as well. But I think ultimately the proposal and the multi-stakeholder community found a common ground on certainly on the issue of contract compliance, what that means, how that interplays with ICANN's mission and remit, and we found a good medium and middle ground on that issue. I think going forward we will be more interested in seeing how the work stream 2 issues, some of those issues we care deeply about as a company, and hope they would be discussed in the first proposal, namely greater transparency within ICANN specifically in terms of ICANN's engagement with governments, getting more clarity into how those engagements occur, what's discussed, etc. We understand that'll be a workstream 2 issue, so we look forward to working on that. Vicky's mentioned the human rights issue, another focus of ours. And a third workstream 2 issue is jurisdiction. It's an issue that sort of more rule of law concerns going forward as to where ICANN fits into that world, looking at California, but also the global context. So those are issues that we had hoped we got a little more clarity on in the first go, but we welcome and recognize that it was important to get the initial work done first and then move on to these. So we're going to be looking at those closely. But I think generally speaking, we're as a company relatively satisfied with this proposal and look forward to its implementation, which is ultimately what we all care about.
Thanks. There's an old joke about getting married, that one of the people getting married is getting married with the hopes that the other person will never change, and the other person's getting married with the hopes of changing, that the other person will change. And I think that's partly a way to describe what took place in these accountability process in particular. Those who saw this as an opportunity for change and reform, in a sense of ICANN, and those who feared the change itself and wanted to make sure that ICANN stayed the same. And the truth is, it was probably neither one, because what it really was an exercise that needed to happen anyway, and was always meant to happen, which is making an organization more accountable to its constituencies. And so this sort of accountability mechanism that the IANA contract offered the federal government was a very amorphous, never used kind of accountability that was nonetheless essential, but it was important to a lot of folks to make sure this organization going forward had strong accountability mechanisms in place. And you've been hearing some discussion about workstream 1 versus workstream 2. And the idea behind workstream 1 is prior to a transition, can there be enough reform with respect to accountability to ensure the community is sufficiently empowered to bring about further reform in the future? So the reality is there may be a workstream 2, workstream 3, workstream 4. There's going to be a constant process of reform of the organization and growth of the organization as it tries to reach out to new communities, as new people become members of the ICANN community, etc. But was there some sort of critical part of accountability that needed to happen prior to transition? And so that had some very fundamental areas. One was the ability to reject a budget, for example, for the community to veto the budget. One was the ability to get rid of the board or to get rid of individual members of the board on the part of the community. The other was putting an independent review process in place that had never really been done in a significant way. Because it was an organization that had kind of been able to push aside down the road the notion of building real accountability framework because the United States government was there. And so it just created this opportunity to have a conversation that needed to be had anyway. And I think that conversation was had. I mean, part of what made this process complex is that everybody saw this as their last chance at ICANN reform. And Congress among them, right? Let's find all these things about malware and everything like this, and none of those things had anything to do with this conversation. It was really just about trying to make sure that there were accountability mechanisms built into the organization so that it was accountable to its own constituency moving forward. And I think that it succeeded in doing that. I mean, are there things to worry about? Yes, I think there's a lot of things that the organization is going to have to grapple with down the road. The interplay between privacy and intellectual property, for example, as under the umbrella of human rights, and is something that's going to be discussed, indefinitely in the policy development processes of ICANN that have been going on now for 18 years, and they're not fundamentally about its accountability. And I think that core, that work stream one, that notion of did we get enough, that the community has the ability to put the brakes on the organization and prevent it from becoming FIFA, right? That was really the goal, and I think that goal was accomplished. And so there's a lot we can nitpick at, and there's a lot that will be discussed in the future, but I think we achieved that core objective.
One build on that quickly. So I in anticipation of the Marrakesh meeting, I, on behalf of the VC, did a blog post on the ICANN website that is entitled "ICANN as an Adult, Beginning of a New Era." Jonathan's mentioned ICANN is roughly, I think it's September, they'll be officially 18 years old. Reached the age of majority, at least certainly in the United States, can vote, can go to war, etc. And I think that the timing, well, somewhat perhaps coincidental, but I think is nonetheless important to note, is that we are at a stage where the commercial internet, and ICANN and commercial internet are certainly go hand in hand for all intents and purposes, has reached a level of maturity and growth that didn't exist when ICANN was first conceived. And with that comes additional responsibility within the community itself as it grows more diverse and geographically and otherwise. And I think the accountability work that's being done now and will be done this year and in years going forward are a reflection of that evolution, both with the commercial internet and ICANN itself. And I think we're looking now at sort of USG sort of being the parent, if you will, of ICANN. The parent is now sending ICANN off to go into the world on its own with its friends and peers to go serve everyone well. And I think obviously that's a big step for kids going to college, a big step for ICANN now. And I think it's long past due. Now we're having this conversation now. It's a wonderful time, I think, for sort of watershed moment for ICANN's history. And not to least to mention, we also have an ICANN CEO starting in just a couple of months, and it'll be a new chapter in ICANN's history with a new CEO coming on, sort of post USG oversight. So a lot of growth and change in ICANN.
So let me bring Jamie into the conversation again. In terms of as pretty much everyone on the panel said, the next stage is implementation, and that'll be part of it. Maybe you can walk us through kind of what lies ahead in the months for ICANN, especially as it relates to the timing of when certain things will occur, before the September deadline versus after that.
Sure. Happy to talk about implementation. But, first, just going back to what some of the panelists just talked about. I think it's really important to recognize what the multi-stakeholder model has accomplished. And as Jonathan articulately mentioned, everyone is equally unhappy, and that's if we can make everybody equally unhappy, we have succeeded. But what's more important to look at here is the accomplishment of the multi-stakeholder community in developing these proposals. There was nothing that suggested that the community was going to succeed. And had the community not succeeded, the consequences would have been devastating for the multi-stakeholder model. But instead, after 2 years, 35,000 email exchanges, hundreds of hours of meetings, lots of heated discussions, the community has come together and put forward these two proposals. And I think that's from a process perspective, something that that everybody can be really proud of. In terms of implementation from here on, there's a number of things that are going on. As obviously, as Larry mentioned, they're going through their review, which will take up to 90 days. Congress is also going to have its own review. There's a hearing obviously today. There's likely to be more hearings in the future. And once, if and when NTIA approves, issues a report approving the proposals, then Congress will have ample time to also review NTIA's report as well as the proposals themselves. From a staff perspective, there's a lot of implementation planning that's going on. So for starters, there's the bylaw process, and we hope to have bylaws out for public comment shortly, and have those adopted by the board prior to the 60 to 90 days that NTIA said it will take. We are also working closely with NTIA and VeriSign in terms of developing plans for implementing the changes that will be required, moving NTIA from its current role and for the root zone functions. And also in putting out agreements with VeriSign, with the addressing organizations, well, the RIRs, the regional internet registries, with the IETF for putting those comments out, putting those agreements out on for public review. So there's a lot of things that have to happen between now and then, but it's important to note that the actions that will be taken between now and NTIA's review and hopefully approval and congressional approval, all of those will be those are all planning. They're all reversible until they until the plans are actually approved.
I want to open up to the rest of the panelists just in terms of timing issues. Both you see any obstacles to meeting the deadline, from the community perspective, as well as as you mentioned, there's obviously a congressional review going on, and there's also a presidential election going on. Do you see politics influencing this process?
Politics influence everything. So especially in an election year. So that will certainly be a challenge. I think there's a lot of challenges against an aggressive deadline, but it seems like the community and the NTIA are hopefully it's a challenge. And ICANN, of course.
So a couple of things. Marrakesh was we were able to, because commercial stakeholder group, which included the IPC, the BC, as well as the ISP constituency, were able to get some commitments from the ICANN board that, notwithstanding any political dynamic that may perhaps require the IANA contract to be extended for whatever reason, the accountability work that's been done heretofore and the work that was expected to continue in 2016 will in fact continue, which I think is an important commitment from the board because so much hard work, as Jonathan can attest, has been done, and we'd be awful for it to fall by the wayside over potential political issues. So I think, though politics may color the discussion and the debate, ultimately, at least with regard to the accountability work, we expect that the train has left the station and is going to continue moving down the tracks, notwithstanding that. Now, within the actual IANA functions themselves, that's obviously a different story. If the contract gets extended, then that changes the dynamic. But I think for the accountability work that many within the multi-stakeholder community are really focused on, that's going to hopefully continue, and we look forward to seeing it move on regardless of politics.
And Jonathan, if you want to add anything on that, it's fine. Maybe expanding a little bit the question, specifically, one of the biggest issues that I think came up at the 2 years ago when this was first announced was the concern about government capture, especially in a country like China. Do you think the proposal has sufficiently addressed that threat to the extent that those with the political leaders with those concerns can be convinced that that threat is no longer out there?
Yeah, thanks. I think Congress has a very important role to play in kind of keeping NPIA to the criteria that it set out and the expansion that and the sort of substance that they added in the .com Act. And I think that they'll go through a thorough process of review, and I think that they'll find that the proposal meets those requirements, both as laid out by NTIA and as by Congress. As far as the presidential race that's going on, I think that the nature of this year's particular race is such that this is far too substantive an issue to play any role whatsoever in the presidential, because there's no, there's just not enough opportunity to get in the gutter over this issue. But the
Never say never.
but to your no, I mean it's amazing, because we work together with 150 people for a year and a half. A lot of crazy stuff gets said, and yet it's all pretty sober as a judge by comparison to what presidential candidates are saying right now. So it's given me a whole new respect for the internet community to watch the presidential politics in this country right now. But as far as the substantive question that you asked specifically about governments, that was a hot topic throughout the process, not only at the beginning, but also throughout the process. Because one of the issues that was broadly discussed was what was the best role for governments in the accountability mechanism. So it wasn't so much about changing their role, which is advisory now. For those that aren't as familiar with ICANN, the governments play a role through something called the Government Advisory Committee, where they make advice to the organization. And there's a lot of reform that could take place there about governments getting involved earlier in policy development, for example, so that they don't throw this advice over the transom at the very end after the community spent a year and a half trying to develop policy. And so there's a lot of discussions about how best governments should interact in ICANN generally that have been going on and will continue to go on. And so the specific conversations are about how governments might participate in this accountability process. Because like it or not, they're part of the internet community. They can't just be completely set aside like, well, because we don't want it to be multilateral, we don't want to include governments. That's not quite what multi-stakeholder means, because they're obviously a stakeholder as well. And so they were a part of this process. There were several members of the GAC that were actively engaged. And I think that, again, there was some discussion about, whether or not the voting thresholds for the board were raised in such a way that it gave governments increased power inside of ICANN, and I think that they really weren't. If you recall, almost the very first hearing on this 2 years ago, Steve Delbianco got up before Congress and introduced this notion of stress tests. And one of the stress tests was, what if the Government Advisory Committee changed its voting structure not to require full consensus? Right now, in order to give advice, there has to be an absence of any objection, any formal objection. So it's virtually unanimous plus abstentions or something for them to give advice. So what if they change that to simple majority or something? Would that really change the dynamic of government involvement in ICANN? And a lot of people thought that it would. And so one of the sort of negotiations and things that took place was about hardening that requirement, that for ICANN to treat GAC advice as special, they would have to maintain that level of consensus. That advice would have to be delivered with that level of consensus. And that was seemed to be the thing that was most important as suggested by that stress test. And what came out of it was sort of raising the threshold very slightly for the board to reject GAC advice. But I don't think that will play a significant role in policy development side ICANN. I think the reforms about the government advisory committees, as I said, are going to have much more to do with how they interact along the way in the policy development process, much more so than how they interact in the accountability process, that will hopefully never be used. Right? I mean, all these mechanisms we put in place were all meant to be in place for purposes of a very, very rainy day. And there's a huge escalation path before any of these things even come into play. So the notion of like who's involved at that point, if the organization really gets to the point where these accountability mechanisms are in play, you probably want every voice at the table. So there'll be something significant for the whole world that's going on at that point. So I think we're fine. I think that requirement.
So I want to broaden the discussion a little bit, moving away from ICANN, perhaps, and talk about the multi-stakeholders and multi-stakeholder process. I think there's a lot of questions here. One, in terms of just looking at what we've achieved with the proposal, does this validate the process? Is that even the right kind of evidence to be used? I mean, as Jonathan, you said, you could imagine people sitting in a room in 2 weeks and coming up with a proposal. So maybe the proposal itself isn't evidence of an outcome that it's working. Maybe we just have to wait and see. But was this just the right time? Did things happen to come together well? Could it have gone badly in the multi-stakeholder process? I like just the reactions on now that we've seen this really play out a lot in the last few years. How it works.
Yeah, so two things on that. One, as I tried to say earlier, no one, at least at ICANN, took for granted whether or not this would work, and I don't think anybody around the world took for granted whether the multi-stakeholder community, whether ICANN, like multi-stakeholder community, would succeed in developing these proposals. And the fact that it took 2 years to develop them suggests that is a strong indication that there was a lot of work that went into it, and there were a lot of late nights, early mornings, around the clock discussions that took place and that had to take place before we could get to the point where we are right now. And as Jonathan said, and I can't believe how often I'm agreeing with him. I think I need to maybe check my meds or something. But anyways, but he was absolutely right. The process is messy. It's like democracy. It is messy. And is there a quicker way to get between point A and point B? Absolutely. Does this? But the fact that the community was able to get together and that so many voices were able to come together and support these proposals is remarkable. The other thing I would say is that there is no pure. I don't think there is a pure multi-stakeholder model, right? I mean, there is the multi-stakeholder approach that the ICANN community has used, and we have been, I think, a proxy for larger internet governance battles that haven't. Because we do have a structure, we are more sort of developed, maybe not as mature as we should be, but still more developed than any other multi-stakeholder model. And now that it's shown to work for our narrow remit for the domain name system, I think there's that much. It has much greater credibility for being used for other. Arguably more important, more difficult internet policy issues than the DNS.
Can you maybe elaborate just a bit on what you think of that?
Well, I mean, there's a whole litany of issues that are out there, like cybersecurity, privacy, taxation, issues of infringement, counterfeiting. Freedom of expression, those kinds of issues, the content application services issues that are at a higher level, higher layer on the internet than the DNS.
Yep. Thank you. Any last one?
I agree with Jamie and with Jonathan that
You really do need to see someone.
I haven't had enough coffee with people here now. This does represent a milestone. Now, whether it's success, we don't know yet. There's a lot of work still to be done, and we need to see 5 years down the road what happens, what doesn't happen. And I put this note of caution in because when we think about the affirmation of commitments, which was 6 years ago, something like that? 7 years ago was the affirmation of commitments, where much function was transferred over to ICANN, and there's been reviews within that time. And one of the questions that I believe continues to pop up in those reviews is contract compliance. So it is a milestone, but we need to continue to be vigilant.
So I think 2015 and 2016 will be seen as some, hopefully not the high water mark, but certainly high-level years for multi-stakeholderism. And I say 2015 as well because, as Larry mentioned in his remarks, this was the 2015 was the 10-year anniversary of the Wilson Information Society. This which culminated at the end of 2015 in December with WSIS plus 10 outcome document, which was an output document put together through the UN that basically outlined the goals for sort of the internet governance community going forward for another 10 years. And the term multi-stakeholder was mentioned often throughout the document, which in and of itself is seen, I think, as a victory, as opposed to sort of the term multilateral. So you have governments recognizing the importance of multi-stakeholders and far more than they did even 10 years ago. Now, as it's been noted, multi-stakeholders can be defined different ways. It is messy. It's an ever-evolving term and dynamic. But I think, and Larry mentioned this as well, as the developing world gets more engaged with the internet, you're going to see other issues, other factors come into play in multi-stakeholders. You've got people that haven't been involved in multi-stakeholderism, if you will, these past 10 years. Because frankly, a lot of it has been the developing world, Europe, North America, that's been the primary entities in these discussions. And you're going to start seeing the other countries now want to get more engaged. India, as Larry mentioned. Excuse me. So I think we have a lot to be thankful for those that are interested in multi-stakeholder internet governance. And I think we're on a good glide path. But depending on the issue, depending on the players, it always can get messy. But I think we should be happy with how things are. And the work that was done within ICANN is just an example of that. But I can tell you that the vast majority of this world has no idea what ICANN is or what ICANN does. So you're talking about a very limited community of people, albeit from perhaps diverse backgrounds. But when you start expanding it into other worlds and within the UN and WSIS, et cetera, then you start really engaging governments and parties that have not yet been engaged. I think that's important. So a lot of work to be done from our standpoint to educate those folks on the benefits of multi-stakeholderism. But I think we're on a good path forward.
Multi-stakeholderism. We participated in the first NTIA multi-stakeholder discussion that was on app privacy. And I'm a huge fan of the multi-stakeholder model, but I can say being in that room as app builders, sometimes we felt like the stake, right? I mean, it was I think the key to multi-stakeholderism is getting stakeholders in the room and having everyone have skin in the game and probably having everyone either want some broader outcome or have some outcome be inevitable and people are trying to work toward making it the best it can be, whatever that might be. So that there's a 90% common purpose for the people in the room, I think is when the multi-stakeholder model is most effective. If the room is really made up of people that could be just as happy if the process is blown up, then it doesn't work as well. I think it works best when you're discussing issues where there is this common interest that keeps everybody in the room. And if you have that, I think that it can be very successful and has been in a number of different fora. And I think that this one is a successful one, and I think it can only get better as people overcome their fears of the process. And as Larry mentioned in the opening remarks, get over the notion that multi-stakeholder model is the way to get what you want, because it very rarely is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm sorry.
Go no, please.
With Jonathan in that for any multi-stakeholder process to work, there has to be skin in the game from both sides. Because I've been involved in other multi-stakeholder processes outside of ICANN where that wasn't the case. And it was a railroad to nowhere. So
maybe you could spend a little more time on that, because I want to come back to Jamie, your point about expanding this to other issues, because I think that is an important goal that a lot of people have, and I think it's an important question to figure out. Can this work for all issues? If so, under what conditions? Are there times where we should recognize it's not going to work and not try to attack that problem with a multi-stakeholder process or do it in a different way? And what have we learned about that?
Sure. So, so I think as a starting point, if it's related to the internet, we should err on the side of at least trying the multi-stakeholder approach first, with the recognition that the multi-stakeholder model is a reflection of the way the internet is built and run. It's all voluntary and it's and global and so. But a great example.
Non-linear.
And non-linear, yeah. So a great example of this working right now, I think, is in the copyright infringement area, where ICANN is involved, but is not the lead, and that's with the sort of the recent agreements between the MPAA and Donuts on having MPAA as the trusted notifier, and which is built in itself, sort of loosely built on the model with the copyright alert system, and also the Domain Name Association has come out with its Healthy Domain Initiative, where registries and registrars are starting to talk about best practices with respect to infringement. And Vicky is and Chris are absolutely right that contractual compliance is still important within ICANN and within the areas of illegal conduct online related to the domain name system. But I think these voluntary efforts are also really important, and they are examples of people getting together with skin in the game to solve common problems outside of the legislative framework.
But are you saying the MPA Donuts agreement, you see that as a multi-stakeholder process? Because
it is a process where stakeholders are coming together and to try to solve a problem, and I think it is a model that there's no reason why it should be limited to those two players.
I guess what I mean by that is there's certainly some groups that have objected to the legal agreement
Right.
for different reasons. I think perhaps more so than you might see in a classical multi-stakeholder process. And so I'm just wondering if the MPA Donuts agreement, is that an example of the multi-stakeholder process not working, or maybe not working, but not working, but having not yet addressed that issue?
So for starters, I would say that the multi-stakeholder or bottom-up consensus model does not mean that there is unanimous support, right? I mean, even with the development of the transition proposal and the accountability proposal, there was there are minority reports attached to those. There was disagreement from some folks with particular parts of those or the entire proposal. So that multi-stakeholder support does not mean unanimous support. And when MPAA and Donuts came together as private actors to solve a common problem, they were stakeholders in the broader internet ecosystem came together and solved. Now, are there others outside who disagree with it? Absolutely. And are there others who will, who will continue to participate in fora where they address those issues? I mean, yeah, and I hope they do. But that doesn't mean that that there's something wrong with the MPA Donuts thing, especially since they were able to reach agreement and including that DNA's Healthy Domain Initiative. That those are efforts that are taking place among stakeholders that are not mandated by government. And so I think those, from that perspective, they should be applauded. And again, as I said earlier, there is not one pure multi-stakeholder model either. And so taking all those things approach, I think into account, I think it's important to encourage these approaches, these experiments, and these developments as ways of tackling difficult issues.
Chris, did you have thoughts on this?
I mean, always going to have naysayers, frankly, anything. I think, the trusted notifier agreement specifically is engaging with two parties who recognize that there's a need to try to find a solution to a problem. And in reality, the trusted notifier agreement is really getting to the heart of Donut's own terms of service that it has with its customers. And so you have a limited universe of people we're talking about and dealing with here. The Healthy Domains Initiative, which is a broader concept, which therefore involves far more people and entities and discussions. And the fact that during the ICANN meeting in Marrakesh, there was a specific session on healthy domains, and a variety of parties came up to the microphone and expressed concern that their voices weren't being heard. In some cases, they frankly were unaware that parties that they shared their interests actually were invited to participate and for whatever reason could not participate, at least initially. So sometimes it's an issue of just not knowing, and a little bit of ignorance. But I think, the Healthy Domains Initiative is, I think, hopefully will be a good example of multi-stakeholderism going forward. It's very much a work in progress. I think the expectation is that we'll have see some of that tangible output by the June ICANN meeting, end of June in Helsinki. But I think to Jamie's broader point, when you're dealing with some specific issues, you have specific parties that have specific interests, it shouldn't be seen as problematic for those parties to get together and try to find a solution. This isn't, I'll just suggest the other parties that might be interested in these issues are more than welcome to provide solutions to these problems too, if they so choose. And if they come up with a better mousetrap, all the better. But I think we shouldn't be throwing stones at parties who I think are acting in good faith and trying to find solutions, by the way, outside of ICANN, outside of Congress, outside of other governments and courts, and hopefully trying to find solutions. So it's a narrow example, but I think it gets to a broader point that all parties interested in these issues are worth looking at. So.
You want to address that specifically?
Yeah, just quickly. I guess it's important to remember that it's really alien to us, the notion of multi-stakeholder process. I mean, we are raised, as children all the way through adulthood to engage in arbitrated processes, right? Which restaurant are we going to eat at, et cetera. And then, but ultimately there's some decision maker at the end, right? So we're all natural-born lobbyists in the way that we interact.
Amen, Brother Jonathan.
From childhood, and that's how everyone in this room is trained to work, et cetera. As far as there is somebody else who's deciding, and the problem is that is an abdication of responsibility by a community when they turn something over to an authority figure to decide. And I would suggest that a lot of the issues that the community had with the ICANN board actually had to do with failures on the part of the community to do its job to reach consensus. Because in theory, the board shouldn't be making any decisions at ICANN. It should only be reviewing whether the community did its job. And I think that's a really important distinction, and that we need to make sure that people, as I said before, stay in the room until they reach some kind of consensus, and then hand that over to those who would review it or implement it, et cetera. And so, again, for multi-stakeholderism to work, we have to get over this notion, well, in the end, I'll just lobby for my way with the authority figure. And I think that that's an ailment from which we all suffer, and that we've been taught our whole lives how to operate. But the notion of sticking it out until, and I talked to my nieces, I said, we're not going out to eat until the two of you agree on where. You can't both come to me and ask me to decide between your two, your two recommendations. And I think the U.S. government has historically done a pretty good job of doing that with ICANN in large measure. And I think the board could do a better job of doing that with its community, and the ICANN community could do a better job of getting its work done before the board's even involved.
I want to come to you on a separate question. getting to this, as Jonathan alluded to, we titled this event, asking for how will internet governance change in the post-American world. I guess if we wanted to be clickbait, we might have said dropping the torch instead of But the emphasis on post-American, I mean, is obviously not. That wasn't actually meant in the context of ICANN specifically, but really in terms of what influence will the U.S. government have on internet policy globally. To the description Jonathan used had of the participants as lobbyists. Will U.S. influence in international forum, be strong or strong enough as we might want it to be in the future? Because I think one of the key elements that's kind of left out of the discussion. We talk about kind of why we're here today, and we talk about that we've said that we're going to do this transition for a while. We certainly had leadership in the White House and in the CIA, Fadi Jihadi supporting this. ICANN heavily involved, but a name that hasn't come up yet is Edward Snowden. And if there's any one person responsible for where we are today, in many ways, he might be the one. So that's obviously impacted U.S. Perception of the United States abroad. So maybe you can speak a little bit to just how you see U.S. government influence operating in the future.
Okay. So a couple things. No question that Edward Snowden has been a big figure in the headlines, but the privatization of the domain name system was something that was seeded before ICANN came into existence. I mean, it was in the green paper and the white paper, and so this has been a long time in development. Secondly, within the ICANN world, governments play, as Jonathan said, we can't push them away. Governments play an important role, and in fact, they play a role that lends credibility to ICANN globally, right? If governments didn't play any role, then governments would say, okay, we're going to go off on our own. And it's important that the governments continue to be active within ICANN. The U.S. government we assume will continue to be active within the Governmental Advisory Committee. It will continue to, there still is the affirmation of commitments that lives on until they are fully incorporated and baked into the ICANN bylaws. As long as U.S. companies continue to play an outsized role in the internet, the U.S. government is going to continue to play a big role in policy, whether it's at the OECD, the WTO, even at the UN and ITU, in making clear its policy about the limits of governmental influence within the internet, what the proper role is. So I don't agree that we're here right now with respect to the ICANN proposals because of Snowden. I think this has been a long time coming. It should have happened. It was supposed to have happened a while ago for lots of good reasons. It didn't, and I don't think that this is the we're at this moment now because of. I would not like to give Edward Snowden credit for the transition proposals at all.
Just to clarify, I certainly don't think that he had any influence on what came out of the process. But you're saying you don't think he had even any influence on us being here today as opposed to next year or even a month from today?
I think if he had any influence, it was accidental. I mean, I think the United States has historically had a policy of supporting the multi-stakeholder model, and I think there was a confluence of events of ICANN reaching a certain level of maturity, and the U.S. government coming to believe that part of supporting the multi-stakeholder model meant letting go of its role within the IANA function, and I thought they came to a point where they were comfortable doing that. So,
any other reactions?
I think there's an element of the Snowden effect, at least politically, geopolitically, that perhaps put additional pressure. Maybe that necessarily wasn't needed by the U.S. government, but I think there was additional pressure put on from other governments that that made it facilitated the decision, if you will, to do this. Jamie's absolutely right. I mean, this wasn't created out of whole cloth 2 years ago. This was an evolutionary process. It may just given that last kickstart to it. I know I was at the Internet Governance Forum in 2014. That's right, in Bali. This was a big topic of discussion at the IGF, and it was. Maybe it was 2013. I can't remember. Either way, the point being that it was a big topic of discussion. It was seen as what is the future of U.S. government role in internet governance generally, and then soon thereafter we had the announcement made in March 2014. So it's not entirely coincidental, but I do. But there are sort of two moving parts in this discussion. But I think it would be safe to say that helped color some of the thinking, I think, within the U.S. government, and maybe this is a good time to really move this ball forward.
Great. Well, I want to open up to this question. One last question. I want to do a quick response on this, and that's just kind of looking forward. Does one of the questions that Larry had was, what does this mean for NetMDL? And I want to broaden that to other forms as well, the Berlin Congress. Does this coming together on this proposal that we see with many stakeholders, does this strengthen ICANN to be the key forum for addressing issues, or does this make ICANN one of many, and we're going to have more and more forums, which could be a good or bad thing, and certainly.
I just want to clearly state for the record that ICANN has no interest in taking on any other issues.
But that might not be ICANN as the institution's decision to make.
Well, that's an excellent point. And I should say that the board isn't, and the staff aren't looking to it. And if the multi-stakeholder community were to come to us with I think it's wildly unlikely that the multi-stakeholder community would have come to ICANN and say, please take on additional issues. But it's possible, and if it did, we would do whatever the multi-stakeholder community wants us to do.
I mean, a central part of the accountability reforms and the changes of the bylaws and else were, in fact, to create stronger fencing around the agenda for ICANN and the remit for ICANN. And so I think it's a high hurdle for that organization to become more involved. And there have been little hints at greater involvement in the past couple of years. The community has reacted to negatively. And so it was a big part of the accountability effort to keep ICANN, to get ICANN to stick to its knitting. And that's not a function of the unimportance of ICANN. It's actually a function of its importance, right? There's such a critical role that they're playing about such a critical technical function of the internet. To have them distracted by talking about broad range of issues about bringing the internet to more people, etc., that do need to happen, but to have ICANN doing them distracts them from their central role, which is to basically make sure that when you type in a domain name in a browser, it gets you to the site that you intended to reach. And I think ICANN was such a remit. Now, to address your question more broadly, I think that this process does suggest that there's more a future for the multi-stakeholder process, that it can succeed, that very diverse interests can be represented in a discussion. So I think you will see this process crop up in other fora as a result of this, because a lot of people were watching it. I think that I think it's a gold star for multi-stakeholderism, but I think ICANN itself is best served by, as I said, sticking to its knitting.
Questions?
One of the questions that Larry raised was, what about China? So that's my question. What's the forecast? Where are they going to play in this game? Not only in ICANN, but in other internet governance forum.
So far, they're going to create their own playing field. Honestly, Mike, I think it's very much to be determined. I mean, they can't be ignored. But they're going to have a decision to make, I guess, ultimately, is what is the best playing field to play on. I think as more and more countries like India come to the realization that it's better to play ball, and hammering this analogy more, but with the rest of the world, that they may see it makes more sense for them to play in that space too. It's unclear. I mean, it's also, their own economic and political dynamics change. That country's political and economic dynamics are changing as we speak, and that affects influence and how they want to engage. So, I think it's just I'm not smart enough to know exactly how it's going.
Is there anything they're doing that gives you hope that they're going to move in the right, quote, right direction or a useful direction?
I have more hope that other countries are going in the other direction. I think I find I see better counterbalance, if you will, and I take more solace in that than I do necessarily what China is or isn't doing. That's.
So just quickly, within ICANN's narrow remit, I mean, I think it's hopeful that China has constructively engaged with ICANN in developing internationalized domain names and participating in the new GTLD program, in voicing support for a unified global DNS. But beyond that, we're they don't come to us to talk about their firewall or their speed, their issues with limitations within China.
I mean, China's had its own route for a while, right? So I mean, in that sense, they're going to do what they're going to do at a certain level, and I think it's going to have a lot less to do with governance issues, more to do with economic issues. And so I think that the camel in the tent, if you will, just having gotten out of the Saharan desert about 3 days ago, I got to learn firsthand why you don't let the camel's nose in the tent. But I think the nose in the tent is in fact internationalized domain names. I think the more that the global internet becomes relevant to the Chinese and to individual Chinese citizens, that you're going to see it harder and harder. And with China, they fight really hard against progress, but I think internationalized domain names is going to play a critical role in bringing them into the international community because of the broadened availability of content for everyday citizens of China. And I think that's probably the one thing that we accomplished in the new GTLD program that is going to have the most impact on China itself and its participation in the single route, and so I'm hopeful, but I think doesn't make sense to hold our breath about it, but just to keep working incrementally. But I'm still hopeful.
So I think what you're hearing is we don't know.
We have time for one quick more question.
There's an inherent tension between open process and efficiency. To Mike's earlier question, whether that's within a process itself or between processes. And Larry had mentioned one of the issues going forward is getting developing countries and developing country stakeholders involved, especially between processes. As these multi-stakeholder processes come about in more and more places, it's more and more difficult for people to get to them. It's hard for even the best resourced companies and institutions to get across these various areas. What are your thoughts on kind of how to navigate that tension?
Process and action. Time for one response, so I'll let you decide among yourselves who will
By
respond.
definition, they all have to respond.
Whatever you want.
Got to come up with it yourselves, guys.
If nominated, I will run. I think that you mentioned it yourself in your question, which is that transparency is going to be key to the interaction of these processes. One of the problems with closed processes is that people don't know what went into them, don't know how decisions were made, and at the very end, when people are completely wedded to the solutions that they've come up with over the past year or whatever, whether it's negotiating a treaty or something like that, that's the point at which the rest of the world is introduced to it in its final form, and they didn't see the sausage being made. And I think that's the strength, one of the strengths of the multi-stakeholder process or a transparent process, is that I can participate along the way, I can raise objections before opinions are hardened and affect change, but at the very least, at the point at which I need to incorporate this into my thinking, I've had the opportunity to see what went into the decisions being made, and I think that that's going to be the best key in multiple simultaneous processes being able to interact. I think the key is in the transparency.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking our panel for being here today. As I said, we are going to be running the video of the hearing here. You're welcome to stay. We have, I think, a cookie bar in the back. We have bingo cards in the back. You're welcome to just